Greenie, it's okay. Basically, it was Terry saying, "Hello, boys, how you doing?"
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
saying, "I've been wanting to be here in the room for that." Like that is so. I don't know what point you were, if you were already at ESPN or where you were when you're sitting in as a co-host at that time. I don't even know.
So that probably would have been. So first off, thank you very much for having me on this, and I'm proud and pleased to be on it and to say a few things about someone that I looked up to as much as I looked up to Terry Boers. Um, when the station started, I was there January of '92, and I was the backup producer on the original afternoon show, which was Dan McNeil with the combination of Brian Hanley and Terry Boers. They would alternate on given days. Judd Surratt was the primary producer, and I was the backup producer. I would screen calls and do sort of whatever other jobs needed doing. And then eventually it became Dan and Terry, the heavy fuel crew. And I was working behind the scenes with that. And then I started covering teams and all of that. And then there was a period of time before I left Chicago for about a year that I went and worked at CLTV. And during that time, I would fill in on ESPN, my goodness, on the score. I would do the Saturday show with Doug Buffone, and we had a terrific time on Saturdays. And then from time to time, if North or Jiggets or Dan or Terry were off, then sometimes they would use me. So it could have been during that time. So it could have been as far back as 95 or 96.
Wow.
In fact, if I had to guess, I would guess that's when that would have been.
Okay, but clearly it was an honor in your mind at the time to work with Terry, and you tweeted the other day about Terry. So we're very glad to reach out and have you get a chance to speak on him. What was he like as a force to work with in those days?
So when we started the score, I was 23 years old, and there were we were a bunch of young guys. It was Judd Surratt and Jesse Rogers and myself and John Suntress and a few of us, and we were all in our early 20s. And to me, guys like Terry Boers and Mike North and Dan Jiggets and Tom Scher and Dan McNeil, and those guys were like gods to me. They were the sun, and we orbited around them. And everything that I know about broadcasting, I started learning there. I went to college at Northwestern, but I got my master's in broadcasting at the Score, and primarily working on the Heavy Fuel Crew show. That was where I really spent most of my time. So while I listened religiously to all of the shows, that was the one that I really knew the most intimately. And that show was so good because Dan was as good at the fundamentals of radio as anyone I've ever heard. I've said many times that I learned how to do what I've done on the radio for my whole career from Dan. And because of the overwhelming magnitude of Terry Boers' personality, Terry was the funniest person I've ever known in person. Starting at the very first meeting that we had, we had a meeting at 4949 Belmont, and all of the talent and all the producers. And it was a couple of weeks, I think, before we actually launched the station in January of '92. And I had never met any of the people involved, practically. And I remember Terry saying hilariously funny things, just sitting in this meeting and listening and thinking, I can't believe how funny this man is. And he was so spontaneously funny, both on and off the air. And then as I got to know him, I realized that his wit was based primarily in his extraordinary intelligence. Like, some humor is kind of dumb humor, but his humor was incredibly smart. Terry was an incredibly smart man. And obviously anyone who ever read him, and I think it's shown through on the radio clearly, listened to him over the years, recognized that. And to be smart and funny is a whole other thing from being silly and funny. Terry could certainly be silly. He could be silly with the best of them. But when I thought he was at his best, when I thought he was as good as anyone I've ever heard anywhere, was when he was being smart and funny. And he could be so insightful and still not lose his humor while he was doing it. He was a brilliant radio talent. And he was very, very easy to work for. He also, he was new to radio when I worked with him. He became a radio icon long after I was gone. But it was sometime in that year in 92 that he left the Sun-Times, that had really been his primary job up until then, and started doing radio full time. So I think there was a part of him that sort of recognized that he was learning as he went also. And in that regard, I found him incredibly easy to work for. He was very good-natured, and he was just a delight. He was a pleasure to be around. I learned as much from working for and working with and being around Terry Boers, honestly, as I have from anyone in my entire career. I was there with them for 3 years, and like I said, I was thinking about this the other day when I got a couple of texts from Jesse and Judd and John saying that Terry had died. That was the way I thought about it. I said, I went to college, and then I got a postgraduate degree at the score. And that's what that time was. And Terry was one of my most important professors.
It's beautiful stuff from Mike Greenberg. And I'm so glad you mentioned Brian Hanley, who is just a prince of a man, a wonderful man, and joins the conversation right now here on The Score as we honor the legacy of Terry Boers. And Brian, I would love for you and Greeny to just kind of take over and talk to each other about.
We used to do weekends together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I always knew he was going to be a TV star. Look at those looks. I mean, Terry would say, "Are you pickled? Do you age? What's going on?"
How have you been, Hanley?
I'm doing very well. Unfortunately, we're getting together because of Terry's death, but God bless, boy. He just brought the whole world together, and just hearing you talk about 1992 and the formative days of the score just brings back such great memories. Just terrific.
There are times, and that's 33, now 34 years ago, that I will find myself singing along to the McNeil and Hanley song that someone did. I don't know if it was Suntress. I don't know who did the production. It might have been a listener that sent it in. I think it was a listener who sent McNeil and Hanley, da-da-da-dum. And I can still remember a lot of the words. And it's just so weird, the things that stick in your mind.
That someone took time, and a new listener to a new station took time. I mean, you really need to get a hobby, and made it McNeil and Hanley. Okay, add a syllable. I don't care. I was just proud that someone would take the time to put their creative juices together and come up with something that we used. That's crazy.
I still remember that. It's funny. So I moved away from Chicago in 1996, and so I am aware of all the things that have happened since then, but I haven't been intimately connected to them. So what has frozen the Chicago media, sports media market in some ways, even though I'm obviously well aware this is no longer the case, is still kind of frozen in the Score Sports Radio 820. And I know that Terry went on to enormous success with Dan Bernstein. I know he and Bernsey became, an institution of a show. And I have no doubt, because I know how great both of them are, that they would have done an incredible show together for however many years they were together. I know it was longer than he worked with Dan. But to me, everything will always be frozen in time of that heavy fueled crew show. That's certainly how I'll always remember Terry, because that's what I was there for. And I was there. I was on the board the day that Mike Ditka said to Terry Boers, "Who you crappin'?"
Oh,
the words "Who you crappin'" were spoken by Mike Ditka.
No.
You were the one who said that about me when I didn't have the fire.
Yep.
So who you crappin'?
Oh.
And I was on the board when that happened. With that first year of the Score, we had the Mike Ditka show. That was one of the things that really put the station on the map, was getting Mike Ditka. And he had,
we paid him like that too, by the way.
Was it Mike Pyle?
Yes.
There was a former player who hosted the show with him. And then I don't know how we talked Ditka into this, but somehow it became where every week, one of the score hosts would then host the show with him. So one week it would be Mike North, and one week it would be Dan McNeil. And obviously he and Terry had a contentious relationship of which I wasn't especially aware, but dating back to columns that Boers had written about him in the Sun-Times, a lot of stuff that I didn't know about. And so that one time that Terry did the show, that was when Who You Crappin' was born. And I can tell you that obviously it begat this sort of legacy segment that I think, lived on forever. But in the moment that it happened, it was one of the most excruciatingly uncomfortable experiences I've ever had in my entire. The two of them really did not like each other, and it was very uncomfortable. And so anyway, that's what I will always think of. But when you guys started it, you and Dan, and then alternating days.
I was covering the Cubs. I was covering the Cubs at the time, so I had to go to spring training, and it was got very difficult to do. And speaking of difficult to do, Phil Rosenthal alluded to this in his great obit on Terry, his column in the Tribune. This had to be August of '92, or maybe last week of July, but I think it was August. Terry was getting inside his head, and he called me. I didn't even know, like, before we started the score, Terry and I were doing a show 3 times a week on the phone where we just call and rip on people and rip on sports and just, keep ourselves in stitches because we had nothing else to do. And, I was luckily in his orbit in the press box where we'd sit together. So whatever Terry said, he and I would just go back. I would just be laughing. And Seth Mason took that to mean I was funny, which wasn't the truth. I just happened to be sitting next to Terry all the time. So he always told me that, he hired us because we had so much fun in the press box, which we did because Terry was there. But Terry called me one day and said, buddy, I don't know. I don't know where this is going. I think Mike North alluded to the fact that we had a 0.0 in the ratings, the first book. And he was getting nervous. And there was a managing editor at the Sun-Times, Dennis Britton, who had it kind of out for Terry at the time, because Terry used to write some columns on and give, I think, Lou Holtz, Notre Dame, anyway, a rough ride. And Dennis Britton was a big Notre Dame fan. So he was trying to figure out a way, he was always on top of Terry and after him. And so Terry calls me and said, I think this is too much. I think I'm going to stay at the paper, the Sun-Times. And I said, well, Terry, what are you doing? I mean, what are you doing? You're too damn good at this. You can't, if you're going to quit something, you got to quit the Sun-Times because Dennis Britton is no fan of yours. And by the way, you're too damn good at this. And he said, no, I don't really think so. And I immediately hung up and called Seth Mason, and his assistant said, well, Seth's in a meeting, is this important? I said, I think it's pretty important. You need to get Seth on the phone. Seth gets on the phone. He says to me, Brian, I'm meeting with bankers, which, for guys who own radio stations, that's a big thing. He goes, this better be important. I said, Terry's quitting. Is that important enough? I said, you need to hang up right now and call Terry and talk him off the ledge. And obviously he did, because within a few days, Terry was working full time there, rightfully so, because Mike North said, without Terry, we don't make it. Without Mike North, we don't make it.
Wow.
But I was like, look, Seth, you got to make it worth his while. I was making $40 like a show when I went in and asked Jeff Schwartz for a $5 raise, and it looked like I was asking for his firstborn. I know we don't have the money. We don't have the $40. That's it. Okay, nice to see you.
I want to hop in for 1 second because that's amazing that you helped keep Terry in radio. And
that wasn't the point of the story.
I know.
That's how close we were. He would call me and just like vent, and I'm like, Terry, you are so good at this. You got to see clearly here, because things at the paper, as a newspaper guy, and I think both he and I always felt deep in our core, even though God bless radio gave us so much, and it was so much fun. I mean, it wasn't working for a living, but he always felt he was a newspaper guy at his core, and in many respects he was, but that didn't mean that he wasn't going to be a radio legend, and he was terrific pretty much from day one.
What he and McNeil did, and you obviously, Brian, but like that show was the template. I agree with what you had said earlier, Greenie, about that show still kind of being the template for those of us who heard it. And then what's amazing is he had a completely different partnership with Bernstein, and it didn't work out right from the get-go. They had to figure it out. I was told recently that he took the producers out to lunch in the early days of that show and said, what can we do? Because they lost to the Fabulous Sports Babe, 2 ratings books in a row. And Terry took them out to lunch and said, what do we need to do to be better? And took feedback and then created this second partnership with Bernstein that turned into what it was. So how about that for a facile brain and professional to then become what it was? Greenie, I mean, you both can speak to what it's like to have multiple partners through the years.
Yeah. I didn't know any of that. Hanley, I didn't know the stuff that you were just telling us at all. I remember when I still remember doing like an open, we sort of did like a bit where Dan and Terry were getting married. Like it was like that was the shtick that we were doing for the promo of it becoming full-time Terry. And I share your feeling. It would have been crazy for him not to do that. Like he was so good at it. He was as good as anyone I've ever heard at it. And for people who are listening to this conversation now, who are a little younger, you have to recognize this stuff was in its infancy. Like now there are so many places that you can hear people talking about sports on your television, on your radio, on the internet. There's podcasts for literally every little micro niche topic within the world of sports that you might want to find. WFAN launched in like 87 or 88, and the success of that station in New York begat a few others around the country. I think we were like the 3rd or 4th all-sports radio station in the country. I went to cover the Super Bowl for the station in January of 93, and they did Radio Row. There were 3 radio shows at Radio Row. So now, for anyone who's ever seen it, Radio Row has hundreds and hundreds but this was at a time when there was almost no one doing this. So those guys, you guys, were really sort of charting a new course. Like it was a blank slate. And the station,
remember the XRT people, we took over. It was a 1-story building in 4949 West.
Yeah.
XRT had the building, and then we took half the building. And these aging hippies who I came to love and know all of them, and I loved listen to the station. They didn't know what to make of guys like Terry walking down the hallway going ee, or smoking out in the alley, and they and one time Blondie, what's Blondie?
Debbie Harry.
Yeah, she knocks on the door. She was at the wrong studio. I think it might have been a weekend show we were doing. And all of a sudden, I see a woman's little head in the square window, and in the bunker next to the radioactive radio tower. And she was looking for XRT, and I got to meet Blondie that day. It was just, it was a weird dynamic because Diamond Broadcasting owned XRT, and they went to add one of the 3 sports talk radio stations in the country. And the score started as a daytimer. And as they were mentioning earlier in the tribute, Murph was saying goodbye as the sun went down because we had to clear the channel for Dallas, right? WBAP, I think it was.
I think it might have been a station in Charlotte. By the way, Deborah Harry. Okay, just needed to squeeze that in. In right there. I mean, look, it is amazing to hear you guys talk about him and to talk about this. Greenie, do you remember personal warmth from him? Because I got to tell you, I remember him being so encouraging that just made it more powerful when he would beat the crap out of you and make fun of you. Like the encouragement, it was, you got the mix, you got the full heart of the man,
Yes, when they talk about sort of the big, gruff teddy bear with the heart of gold, or a grizzly bear, I should say, who has like the heart of gold underneath. That was Terry. Like Terry could be tough. He could be, he would be very sarcastic. But underneath it all, it was obvious to me, and I think to everyone, that he was a really good guy and he really cared about people. Like, again, Brian, you had a totally different relationship with him. You guys were peers. When we started, guys like Judd and Jesse and John Suntress and me, we called ourselves the Score Boys because that's what we were. I mean, I was a year and a half out of college, and like Terry, he was extremely generous in his willingness to allow us to learn on the job. I think he cared that we liked it there. I think he cared that we were happy. I think he cared that we were doing well. I've worked with a lot of people through what is now a 30-something year career that, don't care at all about the people who can't serve them in any meaningful way. And there was no obvious reason to think any of us were going to be able to. But Terry did genuinely care. I don't have one story because it was a daily thing. Like Terry he was a genuinely nice, easy, fun, funny person to work for. And he made being there fun every day.
Well, I think that comes from his roots too. And I think it was Phil's column. And I didn't know this, that Terry used to make $3 for washing milk trucks. His dad was a working class guy and his mom was a teacher or whatever. And so he knew what work was. I mean, he knew not getting paid for really tough jobs. And I think he appreciated everything he had. So I think when he saw people trying to come up through and look, we were making nothing on the air when we started, which meant the guys behind the glass, they were happy to have you intern for free, whether you're getting college credit or not. You guys were making absolutely nothing, who started as producers, associate producers, screen callers or call screeners and all that. So I think Terry knew, and I think I tried to do that too, is just whenever someone came in your orbit, you tried to make them feel a part of it because good Lord, look at all the people, and yourself included, Mike, that just went on to superstardom because they were part of this great organic thing. And you learned on the job and on the fly, and you learned not only what worked in the business, but how to treat people.
Well, both of your careers and both of who you are as people and coworkers is certainly a lovely part of carrying on that man's legacy. And I feel the same way. I'm proud to share him as an influence, guys. We got to go, but this was wonderful. Thank you, Brian Hanley. Thank you, Mike Greenberg, for doing this. Really wonderful to hear you guys talk about Terry.
Thanks for having us. And God bless you, Terry. We'll have one for you tonight. We'll tip one for you tonight.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Brian, it's great to see you again. And thank you for letting me be a part of this. I would just say in closing, if he can, wherever he is, if he can hear me, Boersy, thank you very much for everything, because a lot of the wonderful things I have in my life, I have because I knew you, and I will always remember that, and I'll always appreciate it.
Amen.
Thanks, guys. Much love. It's Mike Greenberg, Brian Hanley.